watching part 4 of a series of discussions on a political theme, uh, the nature of government and reforms that may improve the efficiency and effectiveness of government. This series is entitled Thoughts of a Politically Incorrect Old White Guy. The old white guy part is obvious. Politically incorrect, I'll elaborate on. First off, I am a hunter. As you can see in the background, that's one of my trophies. And I have a house full of similar trophies. Many people regard that as abhorrent, certainly politically incorrect. Second, at this point in my life and for the past couple of decades, I have been a firearms dealer as my occupation, and I'm federally licensed. I sell primarily collectible and high-grade sporting long guns. I do sell the occasional handgun. I do not sell black rifles or semi-automatic handguns to any extent, not because I think there's something fundamentally wrong with them, just that when you're doing business on the internet, long distance, you have to have something that the customer cannot easily source locally to overcome the cost of shipping and transfer dealer charges, etc., etc. Anyone who's further interested in that aspect of my persona can view one or two of my other videos, which were made many years ago on the subject of gun registration and banned or firearms that are considered to be undesirable and should be banned. So that's the politically incorrect side of things. I can add to that, but not right now. In the first part of this series, I talked about the observation that government invariably seems to fail its citizens. And this last week, we just learned that SunPower, a company which received hundreds of millions of dollars of subsidies from the Obama administration to develop or manufacture solar cells, went bankrupt. So there went a whole chunk of your money and my money down the drain. The problem with government interfering in the private sector, picking winners and losers, as some call it, is that they seem to have a knack for picking losers. And in any case, that whole process is so fraught with the risk of corruption and favoritism and vote buying that it should be constitutionally outlawed, frankly. The government should not be in the business of deciding which companies should receive free money or other government forms of government handout. That is not the function of government. Nowhere in the Constitution do you see that listed as one of the responsibilities of the federal government or state government, for that matter. I would also point out in that same vein something I read this week to the effect that only 50% of the murders in the United States have been resolved, or typically 50% go unsolved. And in the state of California, I'm not sure whether this is true nationwide, but in the state of California, only 13% of crimes are ever solved. So much for our wonderful law enforcement arm of government. That is a legitimate function of government, in my opinion. Keeping its citizenry safe and finding and prosecuting criminals is certainly something everyone, I think, agrees the government should do. are just not that good at it. I'm sorry to say. They spend again an awful lot of money and make and say the right things and make the right noises about public safety, but they fail. It's like a coin toss in terms of murders, and their failure rate on other crimes is just abysmal. In California, in particular, they don't even prosecute. I don't think they don't even consider small crimes these days, like shoplifting, to be crimes. So the actual statistic is probably way lower, and that is why you have so much criminal activity. If the chances of getting caught are 13% or less, or zero in the case of shoplifting, there's an awful lot of people who will gladly take those odds. So that whole topic or theme was the subject of part one, government failure. Part two had to do with the reasons why government, it seems to be incapable of punching their way out of a paper bag, and that has a lot to do with the nature of the people that end up in government jobs and the way they're incentivized and motivated and managed, and with also with the sheer size of these government bureaucracies. Take the example of the Department of Education. What exactly are these people accountable for? Nothing. For spending their budget, basically. That's all they're held accountable for, is not overspending their budget, and they try their hardest not to underspend it for fear that it might be cut. So I characterize that whole situation as government does not hire the best, and they do not fire the worst. That was part two. Part three of this series of talks focused on some of the things that we might do about the situation, and recognizing that government is necessary. I mean, there are some functions that are not really suitable for the private sector to undertake. The whole judicial system, for example, it's hard to imagine that that a private company could manage that and execute that. There are some functions like the FAA that are necessary. By the way, here's an interesting factoid for you. Did you know that in the world of VFR, Visual Flight Rules, which governs the most civil aviation, small planes, if you're flying eastbound in the United States, you are required to fly at an odd altitude plus 500 feet. So you can fly at 5,500 feet, 7,500 feet, 9,500 feet. If you're flying westbound, you're required to fly at an even altitude, so 6,000 feet, 8,000 feet, 10,000 feet. Now this obviously, this rule is obviously a wise rule, and everyone accepts it. Nobody fights it or disputes it. And it's an example of one of the reasons why the federal government does have a role in aviation. It makes the skies safer for everybody. So accepting that government is a miserable failure for the most part, accepting that they can't get out of their own way, and accepting that some degree of government is nevertheless necessary, what the heck do we do with this? And I'll add a rider to that, and I'll characterize it in simple terms as government is a leaky bucket. That means if you put $1 in, you might get 50 cents out, and the other 50 cents gets wasted. You only have to think about the stories about $10,000 hammers and $20,000 toilet seats and more recently there was an example where the government apparently invested several $billions in charging stations as part of the infamous Inflation Reduction Act, infrastructure improvement. The government spent billions of dollars to expand the network of electric vehicle charging stations, and apparently for all of that money we got 9, not 90, not 900, but 9 charging stations. Government just seems to be, well, it's other people's money is the problem. And then there's just millions of, maybe not millions, I'm exaggerating, but thousands of bureaucrats involved, all of whom have to have a salary, they have to have vacations, they have to have pensions and medical, et cetera, that quote unquote administer these programs. And in the process, your dollar becomes 50 cents if you're lucky. So given all of that, what the heck can we do about this? Well, let's go back to my topic of the General Electric Company, which was a massive corporation run essentially quite efficiently and effectively. One of the things that enabled Jack Welch to do that is he divided the company into 14 more or less independent businesses, each with their own profit and loss statement, their own business leader, so-called, who was effectively the CEO of that operation, and with their own set of goals and accountabilities and so on. That flowed down to the lower levels of the organization. So one of the, and this is a, the breakup of AT&T is another example. This is a clue. This gives us a clue as to how government could perhaps be more effective. Rather than having one massive monolithic federal government, perhaps what we need is to break it up into smaller pieces and make it more manageable. I would go back also to my discussion of the FAA. Did you know that the FAA is actually comprised of 9 regional offices? Their organization is split into 9 regions. For example, New England is one of the regions. The Pacific Northwest and Mountain region is another. They're not split into 50, one for each state. There is one region for Alaska because of its remoteness, but there are 9 offices on the FAA, and they operate across state lines within their defined geographic area. So that's a figure that seems to make some sense to me. And if you think about Canada, which is a country that I'm actually a citizen of, they have, I think, 9 provinces and 3 territories, and in a country that's actually bigger geographically than the United States. They don't have 50 states or 50 provinces, they have 9, plus the 3 territories, and the difference is academic. Australia is a country where I've spent some time, and Australia is as big landmass-wise as the United States. And Australia has 6, I believe they call them provinces. I'm a bit rusty on that. It's been a very long time since I was in Australia. But, for example, New South Wales, Queensland, Western Australia, Tasmania is there, Alaska, a little island. Australia manages just fine with 6 provinces. And by the way, Australia recently announced that they have a budget surplus. Their central government is actually running a surplus currently, and has been for the last year or so, I believe. They don't have the massive deficits that we have. They seem to be onto some sort of a good thing down there. So this notion of the single central federal government should perhaps be revisited, and we should perhaps divide up some of the functions of the federal government into chunks. I'm not suggesting that we have 50 departments of education, one for each state. That would be silly. do we really need to have, or can one central department really be effective, and do we in fact even need a central function that oversees our education system? Our education system, by all accounts, is a huge disaster. We spend a lot of money. We get almost embarrassing results. This is, I think, something that pretty much everybody except the teachers' unions will admit to. So something's rotten there. That almost any other approach is worth trying, given that the approach that we have is such a miserable failure. Then we have to also question the role of federal government as opposed to the decentralized state governments. The closer those government officials are to the voter, the more accountable they are. So this notion of everything being in Washington, very distant from the average citizen in Arkansas or Oregon or one of the other states, is flawed, I believe. I think that where possible, these functions should be decentralized and made closer to or moved closer to the actual person that pays the bill, to the voter. I'm not suggesting that, again, we split every function of the federal government into 50 pieces. That would be unnecessarily duplicative and complicated. But there are certain roles, I believe, that could be decentralized. If you look at the Constitution, it doesn't authorize a Department of Education. The notion behind the Constitution was that the states basically run their own affairs, and only certain functions are ceded to the central government because there just doesn't make sense to have them executed in 50 different states. So I think what emerges here is a sense that the federal government should be confined to roles where there's a compelling argument for a single entity, single body or organization. And the obvious ones are national defense. You don't want to have multiple armies. You want to have one Department of Defense. Foreign policy. You could argue that the United States Postal Service, there's some odd logic to having a single United States Postal Service. But frankly, I'm not even sure that's true anymore. I think the private sector could easily assume that role. They have effectively done so in the small package arena through United, for example, UPS and FedEx, who are the preferred shippers in many cases for packages. They just don't compete in the mail segment very well, and that's becoming obsolete due to the widespread adoption of information technology, the internet. So there's probably only a handful of functions that really belong at the central level. Certainly, most of the roles of the federal government today are questionable. It's questionable whether there's a real reason to have a single bureaucracy that executes that function on behalf of the entire country. So decentralization, a narrower focus of the federal government are parts of the solution here. And exactly what that looks like would be a very lengthy discussion, and I frankly haven't thought it through in that much detail yet. But do we need, a question I will throw out at this point is, do we really need 50 states? back in, and within that, a subordinate question is, do we really need, I think it's 5,000 counties in the United States. These concepts or notions developed back in the days when people got around on horses or in carriages. There's really no need to have a county every 100 miles or so. You can go 5 times that distance in an automobile and 10 times that distance easily in an airplane in a couple of hours. So this notion that we need to have all these little bureaucracies at the county, city, and state level is, I believe, outdated. What we really need to do is think about a completely new model of a completely new structure where there's one much smaller federal government with the limited responsibilities, and then maybe 6 to 8. Let's take the FAA example. Why don't we do that? Use that as a starting point. 9 states, and then within those states, I don't see the need for all these counties, these tiny little postage stamp counties. Counties should be sized such that any citizen in the county can drive to the county seat if they need to, go to court or physically visit the county offices. They should be able to drive there and back in a day, and that would give you a good rule of thumb for the size of the county. And I bet you if you did that, you might come up with 500 or 600 counties, not 5,000. That's just ludicrous. Now the question is, who pays tax and how is that done? Are we going to end up having 6 or 8 IRSs and then the federal IRS in addition to all these counties that collect money from us? I don't think that's the smartest way to organize this whole thing. I think we should think about a situation where the federal government doesn't tax the citizens at all. And furthermore, I think we need to eliminate the ability of the federal government to borrow money, because that seems to be the root of all evil in terms of waste. I think what we need to do is pay our money to our state where we reside by whatever means that state deems necessary, sales tax, income tax, property tax, whatever, in the amounts that they need to effectively govern, knowing that they're accountable to people who are pretty close, or much closer to their seat of government than in the federal system. And then those states should all get together and pass through some fixed percentage of their state revenues to the federal government, sufficient to fund the federal government, but at the same time put the federal government on a diet. So, and that can only be changed by consensus of the states. So we now then have a system where the money is controlled to a greater extent by the citizenry. The federal government can't go on lavish spending sprees. There are only maybe 10 or a dozen senators. The problem with having all these senators and all of these elected representatives is that every time there's a piece of legislation that needs to get passed, you have to bribe some of them to vote the way you want them to vote. And the way the bribes are accomplished is through something called pork. So they'll have a bill to do something which most people agree is necessary, but there's a few holdouts that don't want to vote for it, and in order to get them to vote for it, you've got to give them something, usually something they require in order to get reelected. So they'll get a piece of legislation tacked on to build a bridge somewhere that's not really necessary, but it'll have their name on it, or to fund some industrial initiative which leads to another Solyndra or Sun Power. We've heard about Solyndra. Sun Power is the recent example. So the fewer people there are to bribe in the federal government, the less bribery will go on and the less wasteful spending there will be. So again, this idea of having far fewer states will have second order benefits in the sense that there are basically just fewer palms to grease. Then we will, if we go down this path in some shape or form, we will effectively have now multiple domestic policies, because domestic policy will end up in the hands of these super states. And that's wonderful, because that enables citizens, in my opinion anyway, to pick and choose the domestic policy they want. If you love communism, well, one of these states might be just what you like, and you can move there and you can live under a communist or quasi-communist set of policies. If you abhor communism and you want rugged individualism, I'm sure one of these states will offer what you want or something close to it, and you can move there and you can live under that domestic policy and pay the lower rate of taxes accordingly. So rather than having one single domestic policy, you now have some choice, and you get to live with the consequences of your choice, and you pay for your choice. The people in some other state are not paying for your choice. You and the like-minded citizens that choose to live in that same state, super state, you get to pay for the policy you want. And then if you don't like it, you decide, well, communism wasn't so great, or doesn't work well in practice, then theoretically anyway, you can change that policy by your vote, or you can leave, and that will have a similar effect. So that right there is an outline of what I think it'll take. It's radical for sure, but we need radical solutions. So what I think it will take to reform our government and basically cut it down to size and make it manageable, and do away with this two-party system we have, where you have a choice of two answers, and neither one is really what you want. Both parties seem to, one way or the other, push us further into debt, and you get to live, if you're in the 51%, you get something along the lines of what you want, the government you want. If you're in the 49%, you get something that's at the other end of the spectrum from what you want, so you're unhappy, and you basically have a divided country. Under this new concept of the super states, you don't have those tensions anymore, and everything will sort itself out in a matter of a few years. Hopefully quickly enough that we don't go bankrupt in the interim. And there seems to be a very real chance that might happen. So there you have it. That's my proposed solution to the morass that we're in. You can comment below. All contributions are welcome. And again, have a government